things looked a bit dicey for a while. And I was lucky, and I came out the other side of it. And I was determined not to waste that.
Hello, and welcome back to the third act. I'm Catherine Fairweather. I'm really happy to reconnect with fellow journalist John Preston, former arts editor of the Sunday Telegraph, whose TV column was always the highlight of my reading week. He is the best-selling author of 6 books, the most recent of which, A Very English Scandal, was made into a BAFTA and Golden Globe award-winning television series starring Hugh Grant and Ben Whishaw. The film adaptation of his novel, The Dig, hit the screens at the same time last year as the publication of his book about the downfall of Robert Maxwell, The Fall. This, too, is being adapted for the screen by Working Title. While he has always been a highly regarded wordsmith, incapable of writing a boring word, it is thrilling to sit beside an old friend who has become flavour not just of the month, but of the year, and possibly of the decade too. No one receives their accolades with greater humility or deserves their successes more. John, it's fantastic to see you. You look like you're floating. Is that because of all this incredible success you've had lately in the last year?
It's either that or an incontinence pad.
So I think let's start with Maxwell, because I think the theme there is this gnawing sense of loneliness that you often touch on in your writing. You've got these isolated characters or sense of being alone and outsiders. And I'm wondering if it's a conscious attraction to the idea of the outsider or the idea of loneliness.
That's a killer question. I suspect that there is some kind of instinctive gravitating towards people who are kind of on the margins and don't feel they belong, which of course may well go back to my own childhood. In the case of Maxwell, I didn't actually realise that he was like that to begin with. I mean, I was just kind of fascinated by Maxwell, and it was really only as I kind of delved into him more that I realised that he was one of those people who did feel himself that could be kind of stuck perpetually on the margins. And he had this kind of characteristic, which I think you do tend to find a lot in a particular aspect of English life, where he kind of simultaneously wanted to sit at top table and kill everyone else who was sitting at top table. Yeah. And he kind of yearned to be a member of the establishment, but he absolutely hated the establishment. And yes, you're absolutely right. He was ultimately, I think, a very, very lonely man with no capacity for friendship, and who pushed everyone away, certainly in the latter stages of his life. And
nothing could plug that hole, could it? That gaping hole of loneliness, not sex, not politics, not power, money.
No, I mean, there's a book...
Or food,
or anything, really. There's a book which I used to love, I haven't read in a long time, by Saul Bellow, called Henderson the Rain King, which is about this rather kind of Maxwellian figure who's a millionaire who goes off to what was then seen as kind of darkest Africa. And he's doing it because he has this kind of constant voice in his head going, I want, I want, I want. And he doesn't know what it is that he wants. And to some extent, he does actually find it in the book. But I think Maxwell was like that. There was this sort of churning frustration that he'd got everything that seemed to bring other people fulfillment, or was supposed to, but it didn't work for him.
No, but I'm interested to hear you say you're coming at these stories and these incredible, charismatic characters from a stance of feeling like a lonely child yourself. Mm-hmm. So you were an only child?
Yes, I was an only child. I mean, I do have a half-sister who's quite a bit older than me, but I wasn't really brought up with her. So I was an only child. I was brought up in a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere.
Where?
There's a kind of little dogleg of Hampshire that goes between the bottom of Wiltshire and the top of Dorset. So I was born and brought up there. There weren't really any other children in the village, or very few. So I was kind of quite a lonely boy. And my father, I now realise, had been very damaged in the war. I'm sure now had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then he got ill when I was 9 or something like that. So there was this really a very dark cloud that hung over family life from that moment on. Then he actually died when I was 18. And I was sent away to boarding school when I was 8, and I hated it, and I was acutely homesick. So I really did always have a feeling of not belonging and wanting to kind of inch towards the warmth, as it were. But that warmth was very elusive. Yeah.
And so was writing a way of a means of escape for you? Or did you know you were always going to be a writer?
English was the only thing I had any aptitude for at all at school. I mean, I was absolutely useless at everything else. And I studied English and American literature briefly at university, and I dropped out of that. And I couldn't really seem to kind of stick at anything. And then in my late 20s, I drifted into journalism, which at the time was pretty much one of the very few professions you could get into, and you really didn't need to have any educational qualifications at all. And I found that I loved it. And to my astonishment, I did feel that I belonged. And it had a kind of rackety aspect that I liked very much. So, yeah, I mean, it in a funny kind of way, it had a sort of odd combination of both sort of warmth and the smell of cordite, which I find very alluring. So, yeah, it satisfied on both fronts.
Yeah, so you felt you belonged there to that sort of tribe of roving journalists. And you have always written about rogues and risk-takers. And I think you're attracted to risk-taking rogues.
Yes, I am. I mean, that's true. I mean, I like people who don't play by the rules. And to my mind, one of the virtues of Robert Maxwell, though plainly not to a lot of other people's, was that he kind of did go through life saying pretty much screw you to any form of convention and sort of that traditional form of British politesse. And I like that. Yeah.
And so with Maxwell, I mean, the story developed even further, didn't it, after the publication of the book, because we've had this huge drama of his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. I think you were meant to be covering that trial. Why did you not? And would you have liked to have covered the trial?
I was at one stage going to be covering the trial, and then it seemed to be an increasingly less attractive proposition. I think I would have found it incredibly depressing, actually. And I'd sort of felt a bit Maxwelled out by that stage anyway, so I felt like a break. And the book that I wrote about Robert Maxwell, you know, of course it touches on Ghislaine and about family life in the family house at Headington Hill Hall. But it isn't very much about Ghislaine. I deliberately tried to make sure that it wasn't, because it was such a big story that if you went too far into it, you were going to skew the whole narrative.
And another rabbit hole you just go down. Exactly. So this success that you've enjoyed after... I think you were arts editor of the Sunday Telegraph for about 10 years, and then you had a rolling contract with them as a TV critic. And then there was am I right in thinking there was a kind of fallow period where you were sort of scrabbling around, well, maybe scrabbling's a bit of a rude word, but...
No, scrabbling's absolutely right. Desperately scrabbling.
Scrabbling around for a new path. Was there a sort of light switch that went on in your brain? Did you suddenly have a sort of epiphany and think, I've got to do non-fiction?
No, it wasn't a light switch, but it was a bit of a dimmer switch, I suppose, in terms of something kind of gradually dawning on me. I mean, I'd written The Dig, and, you know, I'd written some novels before The Dig.
And a travel book?
Yeah, and I'd written a travel book about the mountains of the moon in Uganda. But on the whole, the books had done all right, but they hadn't really kind of troubled the scorers in any great kind of commercial sense. And I did The Dig, which was plainly based on a true story, which was about the excavation of the great ship at Sutton Hoo in the summer of 1939, which, as it turned out, and weirdly I didn't even know about this, my aunt, who was an archaeologist, had found the first gold that was discovered. And that got me started. And
a gift, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a gift, and it was really kind of landed in my lap. And I'd always had this very kind of unfocused idea that I wanted to write, I suppose, a kind of buried treasure story for grown-ups, which was sort of hark back to one of those children's stories like Treasure Island that I had adored so much when I was a child. And that duly turned into The Dig. And then when I'd done The Dig, I made another couple of completely doomed attempts to write other novels. And I just thought, this is not really working out. I better try to do something else. And again, I'd always kind of liked the idea of writing a non-fiction. They always used to be called non-fiction novels. I never quite knew what a non-fiction novel was, whether you kind of made up bits or you didn't make up bits. But I liked the idea of writing something that was, a full-length book that was non-fiction. But I couldn't think what to write about. And I'd always been fascinated by Jeremy Thorpe.
Could you just refresh us on the backstory of Jeremy Thorpe for those who can't remember?
For anyone who doesn't remember, Jeremy Thorpe was the leader of the Liberal Party. He was unquestionably the most charismatic politician in the country. I mean, all the kind of male politicians at the time looked like sort of old grey sofas. And Thorpe was he was younger, he was dashing, he had a sense of humour, but he also was a man with a secret life in that he was gay or possibly bisexual. And he knew, of course, that if any whiff of that ever got out, he was completely finished as a politician. So he did something very, very drastic. He'd had an affair with a man called Norman Scott, which had ended badly. Scott was making threats against Thorpe, and Thorpe took the drastic and, as it turned out, catastrophic step of siphoning off money from Liberal Party funds to pay for a hitman to try to kill Norman Scott. In fact, the hitman, who was probably the most incompetent hitman in the history of hired hitmen, ended up bumping off Norman Scott's dog instead. And when I moved to London for the first time in my very early 20s, the Thorpe trial was going on at the Old Bailey.
1975, was it?
No, this was 79.
Right.
The plot to murder Norman Scott took place in 74, 75, and then he came on trial in 79. And, it was the first time that a public figure had been accused of homosexuality. And homosexuality was at the heart of the whole thing, although it had been decriminalised. The stigma against homosexuality was so great, and none of it would ever have happened if the stigma hadn't been so kind of entrenched and
even in the
vicious.
swinging 70s.
Yeah, really. In a funny kind of way, although homosexuality had been decriminalised in, I think, 68, the prejudice against homosexuality did increase rather than diminish, because it meant that these, if you're a gay man, your head was kind of now rather kind of popping invitingly over the edge of the parapet, and there were any number of people willing to take a pot shot at you.
Yeah.
And so I'd kind of, I wanted to write about the Thorpe trial, but I couldn't find a way of doing it, and it seemed it had been done before. And then I found out there was a man called Peter Bessel, who was a fellow Liberal MP, who had been Thorpe's best friend and then turned against him and became the chief prosecution witness at the Thorpe trial. And he'd been rather kind of dismissed as a peripheral figure. And I realised that he wasn't a peripheral figure at all. He was the kind of, in a way, he was the sort of moral crux of the whole thing, because he was actually the Judas figure.
Yes.
At the heart of it. And that really interested me. And I wrote the book, and for some weird reason, I was just very lucky that it kind of seemed to catch the zeitgeist.
And it did, didn't it?
Yeah,
Immediately.
it did. And
reignited Hugh Grant's career.
Reignited. Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, Hugh's career wasn't exactly kind of,
I think
in
it
the
was
complete doldrums, but
he had been
nonetheless,
stereotyped, hadn't he?
Yeah, he had. I mean, he was stuck with playing sort of slightly silly ass figures, and he'd been doing it for quite a long time. And I think this was the first time that he'd really had a chance to kind of stretch himself in a long while. And so, things did take off from there.
And how did you embrace that? Because sometimes that sort of success can leave one terrified and sort of frozen in one's chair. But you embraced it, obviously.
Well, I think if it had happened to me in my 40s...
You're 68 now, aren't you?
I am, God, yes, 68. It's perfectly possible I might have become horribly big-headed and, full of myself.
Never.
It is perfectly possible, believe me. But, when that sort of thing happens to you in your 60s, apart from the fact it's rather undignified to get kind of big-headed, you're kind of pretty grounded by then.
Yeah. I bet your wife, Susanna, was pleased at this
she was
late
very
flourishing
pleased. She was
success.
pleased and kind of surprised, I think, as well. And I was a bit surprised and very gratified.
Yeah.
But I'd always had this kind of... I never really talked about it because it seemed to be rather sort of unseemly. But I'd always had a kind of desire to try and prove people wrong, I suppose.
People like who? Your headmaster?
No one, all those sorts of people. My father, who'd been dead by this stage for probably pushing 50 years, certainly 40 years. Not my mother, who believed I was capable of anything. But yes, I think people... I just had a sense that... This is going to sound incredibly arrogant, but I did have a sense that possibly I was capable of more than I'd felt about myself.
So you had an innate sense of self-belief, in fact?
No, I didn't. I had absolutely no confidence at all for years and years and years and years. And I'd never really spoken about this, and actually my wife thinks this theory is complete nonsense, and she may well be right. I was sort of unwell, and things looked a bit dicey for a while. And I was lucky, and I came out the other side of it with a sense of being lucky, in the sense that I'd been given another shot.
A reprieve,
Yeah. And I was determined not to waste that.
Right.
Now, to what extent you can really correlate that with my becoming quite successful as a writer, I don't know. But I sort of have a sense somewhere inside me that it did make a difference.
Yeah, how interesting. And another person might have been sort of so subdued by that sort of confrontation with their own mortality that they would have given up, but instead it galvanised you.
It did rather galvanise me, actually. Yeah. And I felt very lucky. And I still feel lucky. And it sounds terribly pious to say that I wanted to kind of repay that in some way, but I just didn't want to fritter away my time.
No, and your talent. And in fact, I mean, you have, looking at you from the outside, here you are, a man in your late 60s, with incredible acclaim and success and awards coming out of your ears. You've got 2 children about to step into their teens, or they already are.
They are already in their teens, mired in adolescence.
Mired in adolescence, but glorious children. I know them well, and a successful and beautiful younger wife, a house in London, a house in the country. This is called success. So, we all have a period of time in our lives where we think our stars align, and I think your stars have aligned possibly in your late 60s.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I do think luck has played an incredible part in it.
I'd quite like to go back to your next project, which is Stonehouse, which is, again, it's also set in the 70s.
Yeah.
Why are you so caught up in the 70s? Is it because you were young and impressionable in the 70s?
I'm sure that's something to do with it. And I mean, I think it was Alan Bennett who said that there's no period more boring in history than the recent past, which I think is absolutely true. But then in a funny kind of way, you go back a bit further and it tilts over a sort of indefinable point and it becomes history. And then it kind of can be interesting, particularly if there's a vivid contrast between the way people did things then and the way they do things now. In the case of Stonehouse, that partly came about because I'd already done so much research into the 1970s. And I'd kind of come across the story of Stonehouse, who basically was
politician.
He was a Labour MP. He was actually the Postmaster General at the end of the 1960s, which was quite a distinguished cabinet position. He was a Czech spy, and as far as we know, the only Soviet spy to have become a member of British cabinet. And he got himself into a terrible mess in the early 70s. He lost, Harold Wilson's government lost power. He wasn't appointed to a job in the shadow cabinet. He founded all these incredibly dodgy-sounding companies, all of which kind of went bust within a matter of months. And he hatched this lunatic plan to leave his wife and 3 children and to get a fake passport in the name of a dead constituent, which was remarkably easily done in those days. And he was going to decamp to Australia with his mistress, who was also his PA, and start a new life under this assumed name, which he did. He left a pile of clothes on a beach in Miami, went off to Australia, met up with his mistress, and was only discovered after about 5 or 6 weeks, because there was a nosy neighbour downstairs who phoned up the Melbourne police and said, there's a mysterious bearded Englishman living in the flat upstairs for me. And that's how he was found. And I sort of vaguely toyed with the idea of doing a book about Stonehouse, and then pretty quickly decided I didn't want to. It felt a bit like kind of going over the same territory. But I did think you could do it as a drama. You could have more fun with the character of Stonehouse, who in reality wasn't that much fun at all, frankly, and had no sense of absurdity. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done the kind of completely mad thing that he did do. So it's a 3-part drama series with Matthew Macfadyen playing Stonehouse and his wife, Keeley Hawes, playing Mrs. Stonehouse.
How fantastic. That comes out this year?
Towards the end of the year, yeah. I assume. And
actually, the key thing you said is sense of the absurd. I think that defines quite a lot of your writing.
Yes.
The wit and the humanity, but also the sense of the absurd, which is why I think you're such an English writer, because you have that sense of irony and the sense of the absurd. Like, for instance, the two moments I remember best in your writing are Charles Phillips, is he called?
Yes.
The main archaeologist on the dig, who was too fat to dig.
Yes.
I love that idea.
That's me.
And the Vidal Sassoon dyed eyebrows of Robert Maxwell, weakly dyed, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yeah, that's true. And actually, I remember when I finished writing A Very English Scandal, and I kind of felt very sad because I thought I'm never again going to find that blend of tragedy and farce. And then actually pretty soon after I started investigating Maxwell, I realised that there was something very similar there, and that, there was terrible tragedy in Maxwell's life, that, he'd lost both his parents, 3 of his siblings, and his grandfather in Auschwitz. But also, it's a moot point whether Maxwell himself had any sense of humour. But people did behave in a very funny way around Maxwell. They just sort of lost
the plot.
They sort of lost all sense of dignity in a way.
Yes.
And Maxwell himself, partly because, again, he had no sense of absurdity, behaved in a sort of absolutely absurd way on occasions. So that was funny.
Do you think that we live in an era in times where people aren't allowed to be such big characters anymore? So actually, you're going to have to go much further afield to mine the subject of your next book. Is anyone allowed to be such a big personality?
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, Maxwell, as he used to say of himself, was a big jungle beast. And I do think there's an absence of of those kind of big beasts at the moment. And, and however morally dodgy they are, they do kind of add quite a lot of,
Well, you'll be
colour
writing
and
about
lustre
Putin
to
next,
life.
won't you? And the next war.
I don't think, someone at some stage will doubtless write what ought to be a very entertaining book about Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm not sure if that's for me. And I also feel that, one should wait and get... Perspective gives you a lot. I wouldn't have wanted to have written either Thorpe or Maxwell without that sense of perspective, actually.
That's true. And the other lovely ironic detail that ends your book on Maxwell is that the superb moment when Murdoch wants to buy the boat, right?
Well, what happened was that, to my astonishment, Murdoch agreed to see me for the Maxwell book. And, I was completely amazed. I remember writing the email. I got an email address for someone in Murdoch's office and sent off this thing thinking, the likelihood I'm going to get a reply to this is about 1,000,000,000 to 1. Actually, I got a reply within about an hour saying, Mr. Murdoch would be very happy to talk to you, which was great. And it turned out that as I was getting up to go from the end of my allocated time with Murdoch in New York, he said, this very strange thing happened, which was that, he and Murdoch had been sort of locked in sort of mortal combat for nigh on 30 years in this race to become what was essentially the kind of biggest media baron in the world. And indeed, in seeking to prove that he belonged in the same sort of arena as Murdoch, it kind of sent Maxwell nuts, and set in train this chain of events that led to his physical, mental deterioration, the collapse of his empire, and ultimately his death. And Murdoch mentioned that, years after Maxwell had died, his second wife, Anna, she had married again. Her husband had died, and she was looking to buy a boat. And I think it was James Murdoch, their son, who was keen on boating. This is not boating as you and I would necessarily understand it. It was, big boating. Decided that he would look for a boat that he felt was suitable to his mother. So he found this thing, which was called, I think it was called the Lady Mona something or other. And she bought it, and everyone was very happy with it. And it wasn't until, again, more time had gone by, that they found out that it was, in fact, Maxwell's yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, which he died falling or jumping off or whatever, which had been rechristened. And to me, I just remember when Murdoch told me this, I thought, right, well, that's the end of the book. And I just felt nothing could encapsulate in what an extraordinary way their fates were entwined in a way that carried on after Maxwell's
extraordinary
death. Yeah.
You couldn't make it up.
No, you couldn't. And it felt like, it really did feel like a kind of Greek myth.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, it's going to be a film, isn't it? Now?
It's going to be a TV series, I think. Working Title have bought it, and they...
Who plays Maxwell?
Well, that's the key issue. Whether it's under discussion at the moment, whether it would be one actor in what I think would presumably have to be the mother of all fat suits, because Maxwell, who was a very good-looking young man, did become enormously fat towards the end of his life. Or they would get different people to play Maxwell at different stages of his life.
I hope that they don't make the mistake of casting... It slightly annoyed me that Working Title cast a brilliant 58-year-old woman's role, Edith Pretty. She was cast as a...
Oh, no, that wasn't Working Title. Actually, that was Netflix.
Oh, that was
And
Netflix.
Indeed, the only reason why that happened
Let's explain what happened.
Basically, what happened was... So, the reason The Dig got made was because a producer called Ellie Wood optioned it when the book was still in proof and doggedly stuck by it year in, year out, and eventually ensured that it got made. And she is, in fact, also producing Stonehouse. And, I long ago had given up all hope of getting it made, and periodically there were I get a phone call from her and she'd say, oh, yeah, it's looking quite promising, and the money's in place, and then the money would vanish, and the casting of it, Kate Blanchett was going to do it at one stage. She disappeared. I don't know what happened to her. And then it was all due to go with Nicole Kidman playing Mrs. Pretty. Mm-hmm. And then it was only about 6 weeks before shooting was due to start, Nicole Kidman suddenly pulled out saying that she wanted to go to her daughter's school play in Nashville and wanted, I think, 2 weeks off in the middle of shooting, which was going to play complete havoc with the schedule. Mm-hmm. So they very reluctantly said, well, I'm sorry, it's not going to work out. Whereupon I kind of plunged into another depression because I thought, oh, God, here we go again. It's just never going to get made. And then, actually, it was great good fortune that Carey Mulligan happened to be available and had always wanted to work with Ralph Fiennes. And yes, you're absolutely right. She was 12, 13 years too young, something like that.
But she played it very well.
But actually, I thought she was great.
I did think she played it very well.
And to my mind, it didn't matter. And frankly, just in terms of, my own personal partiality, I would much rather she did it than Nicole Kidman.
Absolutely. I think I can agree with you there. Completely agree. So secrets to aging well would be, in fact, not following on the Nicole Kidman track of too much too much plastic.
Yes, exactly.
So for you, what are your secrets? Because you are, you've just had a hip operation. I cannot believe you look so youthful. What would you say? Are you following Gabriel Garcia Marquez's idea that actually aging well is really just an honourable pact with solitude? I don't think that's your case because you're surrounded by family, animals, more animals by the minute.
Yeah, that's true. Although I am quite a sort of solitary person. I don't know. I have no idea. Until I had my hip operation, I used to go for long, long solitary walks pretty much every day, which I do find there's something extremely rejuvenating about that. And that and lashings of red wine is really about the only thing I can possibly suggest.
Well, here's to the next 60 years.
Oh.
It's lovely to see you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks again to the inspiring but always modest John Preston. If you've enjoyed today's show, you can hear more episodes in the series by clicking follow wherever you're listening to this, or simply searching The Third Act on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. This episode was produced by Pete Norton and made possible by Auriens, luxurious residences that are redefining later living in the heart of Chelsea. I'm Catherine Fairweather, and I'll see you back next week for another episode of The Third Act.